therefore I am. I am, therefore I will. I'm not
Maybe
dead. I think, therefore I am dead. Yeah. That's a very cogito, right? Well, now it's true. Oh, and I truly did kill 5 minutes just rambling.
Thank you.
Not a problem. So that was the entertainment portion of my little attempt to break into this incredible lineup we have today. So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the first day of the Thesis Symposium for the Low-Residency MFA program here at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. This is a wonderful opportunity to hear about what your classmates have been ruminating on, transcribing, rewriting, and finalizing as they have completed the written component to their thesis work. And I know for the twos in the audience, we'll be meeting very shortly individually to start that process. And I know that I've had conversations along the way, but I think it's also just a really great opportunity to see what those a year ahead have done, and know that that path is well tread with a range of ways to address how you want to talk about your work. And I think today's presentations from Brighton and Kate should certainly show some of the gamut of what can be approached so that you can really make the written thesis your own. Of course, for everyone who is graduating in August, it's great to see what your colleagues have been thinking about and why they may send you the strange message about something existential at 3 a.m. in the morning, because that's just what happens when you're knee-deep in research. And while I know there are some who don't necessarily believe in the importance of research to a studio life, I think it's really vital to just being, and whether it comes into your studio work or not. I feel like there's a proper balance of knowledge and unknowing that is a curiously fluid equation that changes, because as you gain more knowledge you start to realize how much you don't know, but that's also the exciting thing, and hopefully resonates a bit to some of what you all are exploring in your studio practice, where you may start to think that you know what you're doing in your studio and then you don't know what you're doing, but that's part of what makes you know you're on the right path, that there's always still something yet to be discovered in this field that is not bound by determined rules, but ever-changing rules and ways of thinking. Unless I babble any further and take up time from any potential hour-and-a-half long presentations that I may not remember being an hour and a half because of my ability to bend time to my, well, maybe not my will, but to what I need to get my will through the day, I will turn over this fine podium to Brighton. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Richards, and thank you for advising my not one but two thesis documents. So I started this by thinking about the history of night in painting, and as I was writing that and finishing that, I kept coming back to Agnes Pelton, who I've had a long sort of research academic relationship with, and I'll go more into that. But this project really is about sustaining the things from previous schooling and previous relationships into future projects. So with that, I just, in terms of acknowledgments, I want to do this now because there's a couple of people that I want to thank. So thank you to my wife Chelsea and daughter Abigail for their patience, to Michael Kelly, who is the foremost expert on Agnes Pelton, who has contributed quite a few insights into this, to Dr. Erica Doss at University of Texas, who wrote the book Spiritual Moderns, for reviewing my research and for also just giving general encouragement. And then to Betsy Fulmer and Carrie Walters at the Phoenix Art Museum. And then finally to my art dealer and Michael Zakin's widow, Leah Skidmore, who gave me access to much of Michael's papers. So, without further ado, This is just giving you the table of contents to show you the scope of this project, which began as a simple 5-page paper and then expanded significantly. So Agnes Lawrence Pelton, born in 1881 to American parents in Stuttgart, Germany. Her father died when she was 9. The reason that they were living in Stuttgart was her maternal grandparents got involved in a sex scandal with Henry Ward Beecher. And because of the tabloids and publicity surrounding that, their family was, put into shame and all of that. And so they left to an ancestral home in Stuttgart. After her father died of a morphine overdose, after her father died, her mother and Agnes moved to Brooklyn, where her mother set up a music school teaching piano, and Agnes helped teach the young students there. In 1895, Agnes went to Pratt Institute and studied with Arthur Wesley Dow, and then in 1903 she bought a farm in Connecticut. Some of you will recognize Agnes Pelton's name from the exhibition Agnes Pelton Desert Transcendentalist, which opened in the spring of 2019 at the Phoenix Art Museum, and then traveled to the Whitney Museum in New York City. It was set to open in March of 2020, before being open one day and shutting its doors due to the COVID-19 pandemic. It reopened to critical acclaim by the New York art community. My experience with Agnes Pelton goes back to about 2008, 2009, when I first met Michael Zakin, shown here. He ran the museum at Pepperdine University, and I worked as an art handler with him. I also took all of his art history classes, and this is his first book on Agnes Pelton, Poet of Nature, published in 1995-96 from the Palm Springs Desert Museum. This was the first text on Agnes Pelton, which showed not only her biographical material, but also a critical analysis of many of her works. Since, over the last 30 years, more than double the number of paintings have emerged. And in 2019, when the Desert Transcendentalist exhibition catalog came out, it was only one-third more, but since then there have been even more paintings to emerge. So this text that I've written really serves as not only a continued critical analysis of new paintings, but also going back and revisiting a number of core topics to really important paintings in her oeuvre. So there's us with Michael at the Desert Transcendentalist, opening in Phoenix. Michael died in January of 2020 after a long battle with pancreatic cancer. So this is also a sort of personal continuation of his work. So in 1993, Michael Zakin started on this pursuit of Agnes Pelton. I love this photo. This is from his personal archive of photos, pulling a meadowlark song, Winter, out of someone's garage. I love that there are trash bags in the corner. 30 years later, this painting, The Fountains, hit Christie's auction house with an expectation of 1.5 to 2.5 million, and it superseded that to 3.4 million, purchased by Museum of Modern Art in New York City. And the wall label at MoMA is a direct quotation from Poet of Nature. So, in 1903, Pelton purchased a Connecticut farm with very likely an inheritance from her grandfather. And in 1920, she moved to a rented windmill in Long Island, New York. She lived there for about 10 years. Then in November of 1931, she moved to the desert of California, to Cathedral City, because there was a group of theosophists in that area at the time that she connected with. Prior to 1913, she was trained in Algonquin, Maine, under Hamilton Easter Fields. There she learned to draw from the figure and also from the landscape. So I add these in because a lot of times when we think of Agnes Pelton's work, we think of abstraction and we think of these sort of transcendental figures that are sort of do not have form, but to put her in the lineage of this academic realism and then to say how she has moved away from that intentionally while also building the skill of really, glazing and tradition of painting that dates back to the Renaissance. So this painting, Vinewood, was in the 1913 Armory Show, and here we have a first look at some of her sketchbooks. So, I also want to thank the Archive of American Art for allowing me access to her papers, not only online digitally, but also in person in Washington, D.C. So here we have Vinewood. I don't want to spend much time on this, but it does serve to see her continuation from the beginning of her career all the way through to her death of how detailed her notes are on each of her compositions. So every single one of her paintings has a full graphic composition like this with detailed notes, either talking about the importance of the image, what's in the image, or just literally her process, labeling, first I did this, then I did that, then I went on to do this. Her time in Connecticut really has not been looked at all that much, but Christopher Knight in 1995 opened his analysis of the Poet of Nature exhibition by saying, Agnes Pelton, a lesbian, and then goes on after that. Her sexuality has not been really fully examined, but as I went through the AAA Archive of Pelton Papers, it became clear that her time in Connecticut really was like a retreat away from the norms of society into a space where that she could be fully free and fully herself, not only artistically, but also sexually. So I want to really focus on this painting, The Messengers, from 1932, which is owned by the Phoenix Art Museum. The Phoenix Art Museum granted my request to see this painting and their other painting, Day, privately. So that was really a wonderful experience. So Michael Zakin wrote about Messengers in 1996. Messengers, one of Pelton's first desert abstractions, embodies all her stylistic features. She depicted desert heat as a soothing, nurturing vase, a tranquil well of light rising above the day, rocky, inhospitable terrain. It is topped by a series of vibrant yellow palm fronds which offer shade and refuge. Pelton's first desert home was roofed with palm thatch. The form of the vase often appears in her art, symbolizing comfort, containment, and security. LA Times art critic Christopher Knight reviewed the Pepperdine version of Poet of Nature in 1996, using Messengers as the main image. He took Zakian's analysis of Pelton's work and spread it to the vast art-viewing public. He wrote, Messengers is a darkly beautiful picture in which an iconic vessel of radiant light crowned by 6 golden palm fronds hovers beneath a stylized aurora borealis and over a rocky nighttime desert. A big blue orb rises on the horizon. Zakin's initial 1996 analysis of the painting served as the foundation of his description in Agnes Pelton, Desert Transcendentalist, and also in all of the future information about the painting. While many dismiss its landscape, the desert, as barren and lifeless, she possessed the compassion needed to understand that it was brimming with overlooked beauty and inner vitality. I'll not read the rest of the quote, but he continues to say that it's a desert painting and that the golden arches are in fact palm fronds. Now, in Pelton's sketchbooks, this is the only, or was, the only entry for this painting. The Messengers, 20 by 28, which is the size of the painting. And off to the left, February 7th, she says, feathers of light, light bringers. And that struck me because Michael had been saying that these were palm fronds for the last 25 years. And there's no mention of palm fronds anywhere in Pelton's own account of the painting. A couple other interesting things about this page from her sketchbook. The first is where it says, from old book, January 27, 1931. Now, January 27, 1931 is prior to when she moves out of her New York windmill and into the desert. The other thing is that her description, her full description here, starting in February and ending in early March, is that it only describes the finishing of the painting. It does not describe her beginning, and there's no full compositional study. The only sort of drawing that is there are the arched, what Pelton believed at the time to be feathers. So that struck me, one, because there's always a complete diagram, complete composition of every painting, and this one, being one of her most beautiful paintings, does not have a full composition. This is outside of her normal process of working. So then she kept really detailed lists of where all of her paintings were in each, or where all of her compositions were in each one of her sketchbooks. This is a later sketchbook, and at the last page of the sketchbook she creates a full list, and under the second sketchbook it begins with Primal Wing and a date of 1930. At the very end of that list is number 117, Messenger. Oh, that's interesting. So the problem is the book that contains the composition for Primal Wing ends at the ray. So from the voice down to Messengers, theoretically, is not there. So I went back and looked at the composition for Primal Wing. The drawing on the left is from the quote-unquote old book. The drawing on the right is from the same sketchbook as Pelton's later, The Messengers, the page that we just looked at. The Primal Wing carries with it a date of 1933, so it's an even later painting than The Messengers. So this struck me as odd. And then also when you see her initial composition, toward the bottom it says page 53, big book. So she's making a little trail of breadcrumbs so she knows exactly where that composition is, which also tells me page 53, which is on the right-hand side, is in fact a composition for the same painting. So there are a couple of advancements in scholarship here. Then I wondered, where is the rest of this sketchbook? And going through the Archive of American Art, through their lists, there are a number of sketchbooks, a number of files which have not been digitized. So I wrote to the Smithsonian and asked them if they would be willing to digitize that for me, which they did, and delivered 900 individual pieces of paper scanned to me in a number of PDF documents. So that's fun. But in one of the documents, and these are my photos from being in person in DC, one of the documents, or one of the files, is another half of this same 1930-1931 sketchbook, Volume 2, it says 1929 to 1931, and in that sketchbook is this piece of paper, which is, in fact, the composition for the messengers. Here we have, you can see the same rock formation, the sort of orb, and then here are the arched forms, and the little, what she calls a purple mystery, the little curtain at the top. And Pelton's notes on that read, January 27, feathers of light, pale golden radiating and confining 8 radiant, sending light down through the sky, gradated from very dark to pale. And I love this page not only because it shows the composition, but also it has her fingerprints in paint on it. So we know that she's, and many of the colors in the composition are the colors in the painting. We know she has this in hand while she is making the painting. And there's the painting with the composition. Another thing that is in the file at the Smithsonian, which I was not aware of, is a list of her poetic introductions to her paintings. When The Messengers is viewed as a desert abstraction with palm fronds, this poem makes no sense in connection to the painting. But when we view it as feathers, it comes to be a direct correlation. The Messengers, approaching darkness above the works of man, of steel and iron beside a sea. A purple mystery above is faintly visible from it descending as feathers gently. 6 golden messengers of light, their glow through darkness to remain a presence and a benediction. With her analysis in her sketchbook of her ideas, as well as her poetic introduction of the painting, it becomes clear that these feathers are not just birds' feathers, but they become much more spiritual, much more transcendent as sort of angels' feathers, delivering a message from the divine over what she calls the works of man, the iron at the bottom. A number of days before the composition for the Messengers is this composition for Cold. The January cold in the windmill. She writes in her, on this page and pages surrounding it, that it was bitter cold and she could not get warm. And so she creates a composition here. The painting for Cold, we do not know that the painting exists. It very well could exist. I think it's probably unlikely. It doesn't show up anywhere in her lists. But we see the beginnings of the composition. We also see the beginnings of this sort of light vessel and the idea that there's something at the top of that painting. This photo is from the same month of little pigeons outside of her home with all of the snow on the ground, and she does 6 pages or 3 spreads of pigeon drawings, which serve as, I think, the inspiration for the feathers. Also at the time she's reading, this is just a number of pages before her entry for the painting, Algernon Blackwood's The Bright Messenger, who's a theosophical writer in the 1920s. He serves as inspiration for H.P. Lovecraft and many of those later 20th century authors. She goes into great detail here, even citing O'Keeffe on the right page. You can see O'Keeffe listed there, and how O'Keeffe was influenced by by Blackwood as well. So when looking at the sketchbook in person, you notice something else, which is that the painting or the composition for Messengers is on the same spread as the composition for Illumination, also thought to be lost. The idea that these two paintings are linked thematically has not really been written about before. So here is Illumination with its composition on the right. Also, a number of pages later, the painting The Guide and its composition from 1929. This is Sandstorm, which Michael Zakin had compared the Messengers to. The reason it was compared that way is Sandstorm, the composition for Sandstorm, appears 2 pages earlier than that first entry which I showed you, which details out the finishing of Messengers. But when we think about this painting as not being started in the desert, but rather being finished in the desert, and started and thought up and composed in the winter in New York, it serves much more as an apt comparison to Illumination and to The Guide. I went a little obsessive in researching The Guide, and also in Messengers. There is another Messenger painting from her exhibition in 1929 at Montrose Gallery, which includes The Fountains, which is that painting that MoMA now owns, and on the list is number 5, Messenger. Well, in 1929, this painting does not exist yet. She's not even done the composition for it yet. So there's an earlier version of The Messenger. Also, it's not plural, it's singular, which is interesting. And in her sketchbook, here's the composition for the earlier 1929 Messenger, which this page has become important recently because the composition Flowering here, which also was in the same show, just recently emerged and is now at auction at John Moran Auctions in Los Angeles. There's that painting, never before seen until about a month ago. Well, I immediately compared the earlier Messenger composition to The Guide. It made sense. They're not the same painting. I thought for a while they would be the same painting, but the sizes are in fact different. The first Messenger is 14 by 20 inches, whereas The Guide is nearly 30 inches tall. But I love the comparison of the two paintings together. Here's the back of Messengers. We don't often get to see the back of paintings. It was damaged at some point. You can see the sort of repair there on the front, and there's the patch repair. Not exactly a wonderfully beautiful job, but it does the job. So, what was she thinking about other than birds in the cold? And I think the fact that she was in the 1913 Armory show at the same time that Brancusi was, and given that Brancusi, around the same time as Messengers, is thinking about birds in flight, it makes an interesting comparison between the two. So Pelton's Messengers, a transcendent abstraction conceived in New York, depicting the extreme cold and feathers of light, becomes a far more important image directly related to the history of American modernism than when it is considered a California desert landscape inspired by palm fronds. This shifted interpretation of Messengers places Pelton at the center of the New York art world at the beginning of the 1930s in the midst of the maturation of American abstraction. She was considering the same concepts of form, space, and transcendent spiritual content as so many canonized members of the New York modernist movement of the first half of the 20th century. And I'll beg your indulgence for one more painting. There are very few paintings in Pelton's work where she repeats the same composition. This is one of them. Light Center, 1947, 48 on the left, and Light Center, 1961 on the right. The 1961 date has always been a little bit of a conundrum because this painting was the last painting on her easel when she died. Well, going through a number of the new scans, we've never had this image before of the composition. We see a number of curious things. First, Light Center had always been a sort of, idea of the light transcending and sort of entering the light into the beyond and all of that, which, that's true. However, when we look at the composition, that's not immediately what Pelton was thinking about. First, the top of this page is rather curious. Her first title is actually not the one that's boxed here. That's a later addition. She always goes back, if she revisits the painting, or if she revisits the composition or retitles something, she goes back and does a box around something. That notes a later addition to the page. Sometimes she obsessively would go back 3 or 4 or 5 times onto the same page over the, across decades. But her initial title was Talisman, not Light Center, which is interesting. A talisman, something that you take with you, something that you hold on to, something that's in remembrance of something else, or someone in this case. So at the top, Sunny, Ms. Grove, Mrs. Orr. And that note at the top is a description of a person, Sunny Orr, who came to visit her, that she immediately was smitten with. The other thing that is interesting on this next page, which is in a different sketchbook from a number of years later, is in the middle of the page here, April 27, 1949, she details out sort of business arrangement for someone taking her paintings on consignment, and that this person is going to act as her, as her dealer for these number of paintings. And she lists paintings that we know about, Future, Star Icon, etc. But she also lists a couple of paintings we've never seen before, which is interesting. And directly underneath it, she does a little drawing, which is very much related to Talisman or Light Center. And it says, like the original, Home Light. Now we have a third title related to the, quote, original painting. And she goes on to detail how it will be different than the previous painting. Softer blue, not quite as bright sky in the distance. So here is my transcription of her details for Talisman from 1947, which is the first painting. Quiet group blues plus violets that you can look into. She came in a suit of crimson, rose, delicate, fiddly lace, flowers showing around the wrists, and snowflakes. Low, gentle voice reminded me of mirth. On low, murmuring water, emotional undercurrent, warm but twinkling quietly. Eyes very dark brown, rich but not reddish, deep brown. And this insertion of her sort of talisman, what she's taking with her from this interaction with someone who she's not having a romantic relationship with, but is immediately struck by Ms. Orr's persona in the room, and also what she's dressed like, really harkens back to her earlier work in 1910, 11, 12, and also a number of other paintings that she relates to another romantic interest. Here's another slice where she describes home light with a dash talisman. So now we have a sort of compound title, Home Light Talisman for the first painting. And the second painting is in fact titled Light Center. this revisiting of these sketches also lead me to the fact that Light Center really ought not to carry a 1961 date with it, but ought to carry a 1949 date, as we know now that the painting was started in 1949, 1950. The only thing that I would say why she moved it to her easel right before her death is that the later painting, Light Center, has a charcoal outline of a 12 by 16 space and a note written on it, cut. So she had intended, right before her death, to cut down the second painting to just be that light center and not the rest of the painting. So with that, I thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed. This obviously will continue for a really long time, but thanks so much.
Questions?
Oh, question.
Comments for Brighton?
Yes, Kate Moran.
Brighton, I was just a little disappointed that I didn't see any of your paintings. So I'm kind of wondering, you know, that you seem to be very, very interested in the process of research and how that might be applicable to what you're doing now. I mean, do you engage in that kind of research when it comes to your own work?
Yes, I do engage in quite a bit of research surrounding really the artists that I'm looking at related to my own work. I will say one of the things that I've taken away from Pelton is really just her obsessive note-taking about every part of her process that I do not nearly do, but I have been trying to add on to. Not necessarily noting, you know, first I did this glaze, and then I did that glaze, and then I finished it, and dating all of that. I think that, you know, in today's world, we have these, which takes a lot of that, you know, when you take a photo of a painting throughout the process, it automatically catalogs where she wasn't able to do that. But no, I'm thinking a lot about that research for sure.
And do you also document color?
Do I document color?
Well, she wrote a poem and it was like very color,
Yeah,
you know.
yeah. She even, in many of her pages, she's documenting the exact pigments that she uses, and exact color combos, what paint she's mixing together. No, I don't so much, but that would be a great addition to my own process for sure.
Yeah, like Kate's, you know, kind of questions, because yeah, I think there is, you know, a lot that can be done. I know with some of you in our critiques, I talk about kind of building these binders that, you know, you just keep all these notes together for easy reference. Although yeah, certainly digitization makes that maybe not the natural way that we go about it. And it's, you know, curious to think about, you know, how research will be hampered as well as benefit from the kind of premise of the digital archive. You know, I really appreciated, you know, getting to, you know, work with you not only in your thesis but this as well. And you know, I think, you know, for all of us who work with you, you know, we see the connections in terms of kind of thinking about how to subtly and not so subtly evoke the spiritual side of existence through paint and things that abstract from reality. So I, you know, appreciate you using this tangent to open up this kind of question of research. And you know, there's just so many thoughts that I have in regards to that. On the one hand, I feel like, you know, I really was a horrible art historian, because all these kind of very traditional art historical research techniques that you've used here are the things that I rely on other people in the field to do, as I then kind of ask more philosophical, theoretical questions that say, why did you do this in the first place? But the research also points to some of those things that I talked about in my dissertation, as well as at various symposia that I get very perplexed looks at from people in the field as I annihilate the field, which is this element of art historical mistakes, so the way that they were as palm fronds. I don't know whether it's because you're in the Southwest and in California you just automatically have to force that in, but how then that error gets then repeated and then creates something that kind of closes off the research, whereas the feathers of light, as you I think beautifully did, just opens it up in so many ways. I mean, I'm going to, like even Paul Klee and the Angel of History, I mean, I'm going to not just kind of the connections you make to the proto-abstract expressionists, but really how it does fit into a kind of way that fits it into the kind of discourses around early modernism, especially around the kind of speculations on spirituality in the midst of the critique of modernity. And that, as you know, I don't have to tell you since you spent a lot of time out in Arizona, but that, you know, there is this way in which the American regionalism really pushes everything on the West Coast to the periphery, as opposed to things in New York that somehow were in more conversation. So I think that's I really appreciate that. And then, yeah, thinking about these mistakes in terms of my dissertation, you know, there are two things that I, you know, very distinctly recall that, you know, really show how the interpreter's will, it's not even subconscious, sometimes it's just a conscious decision. So I remember one of the people I wrote on was a little known architectural draftsperson, Jean-Jacques Lecoeur. And his work was basically a parody of like Ledoux and Boulez, the kind of prime neoclassical architects who were accepted by the Academy. Lecoeur showed like a couple of drawings in his lifetime, maybe built one building, maybe, and it's hard because he has all these fictions in his notes and everything. But there's a German architectural historian who's working in the first half of the 20th century. And he wrote a book, The Three Visionary Architects, because, you know, 3 is the magic number, right? Especially in the Judeo-Christian tradition. So he wants, okay, I got Ledoux, I got Boulez, okay, there's this Lecoeur guy, but all these obsessive notes about how things should smell are a little weird. And that's clearly a cloud. Why does he have to list it as a cloud? Let me get the eraser. So we literally erase this artist's work to make it fit into his argument. Yeah. So there's that example. Then there's just the sloppiness that comes from repetition. So the same artist was, oh, well, the worst thing about Kaufman, sorry, I just have to put this in because I have to do this to Kaufman at any time. The competitor over the interpretation of Lecoeur was the literary critic, Hélène Rosenau, a French woman. And so German man versus French woman, that just doesn't make any sense. So he used basically his power to silence this person who actually was more on spot with the interpretation, and it was just loaded with all that.
To that idea of the mistake too, you know, one of the things that you and I talked about early on is just sort of tiptoeing on, but also maybe just sort of full on stepping on the idea that, one, Michael made a mistake, but also all of the art historians that followed after that repeated it without additional research. And, you know, people who have gone on to now head, you know, curatorial departments at pretty major museums that really didn't do their own research, which is a giant problem for art history. You know, there's no reason why a graduate student, you know, after a major retrospective at the Whitney should be revealing some of these mistakes later on. It really should have been people constructing that exhibition. Now, to give them some grace on that, constructing a major, you know, multi-site exhibition is really a lot of work, and the process goes, even though they have a number of years to plan, the process goes very quickly. But yeah, the idea that only, you know, maybe 2 other scholars have been to the AAA to pull the boxes of research is kind of crazy to me. So
it's mind blowing. And
yeah,
to that effect. I mean, then there's the other kinds of sloppy mistakes. So the same artist Lecoeur. There was an interview with Teenie Matisse, Duchamp's widow, who said that Lecoeur was his favorite architect. People are like, what? Who is this person? How did Duchamp, you know, discover him? Well, Duchamp worked in the Bibliothèque Nationale. That's where all Lecoeur's drawings were, and it totally fits that this would be an influence. Even Eros C'est la Vie's, you know, there. I mean, it's just really extraordinary. But the research into that kind of connection in terms of academia happened in French. There's an American scholar, I'm blanking on his name, I forget, it's someone I studied with, so maybe I'm protecting them in some level, but they basically wrote a book published by Yale University Press, so peer-reviewed, that this artist was Duchamp. That Duchamp made all these drawings that were in the Bibliothèque Nationale and buried them there. And it's like, no, you don't. But that's published somewhere. So somewhere, some scholars are going to read this and think that this architect who had a very complicated life and is really prescient, I think, the questions that we're thinking about today, it was actually just Duchamp, and Duchamp did this as a joke. So yeah, there's just the kind of, pragmatic mistakes that happen and, are part of the complexities of it all, and then there's just the sloppiness, and then it gets to this kind of way that then maybe this is why sometimes people, don't when they come from the studio art field, don't, have a lot of faith in art history as a field, but, we're humans and we make errors. And then that gets to kind of the point that you were pointing to too, that I think one of the things when you do this research is that once you research an individual artist to the kind of extent that scholars do, you have their lives in your mind. So there are moments when I'm on a train and I go, oh, here's Theodore Géricault's life. There's his mom dying at 8. This is how it is. I mean, like I have this whole story that maybe a couple other people do. And that's where you start to really realize how contingent knowledge is, how precious it is, but the kind of care that it takes to not just let it settle in this way for your own sake. And this was always one of the big battles when I was a grad student, to get people to stop thinking that somehow as we progress, our knowledge progresses. Like, no, we're more prone to the kinds of mistakes that come up because we don't have that level of care looking to these details. So I love all that.
Thank you.
Sorry. Okay.
It's not lost on me that Brighton, you're a painter, and your mentor, Michael, is a painter.
Yeah.
And that in your approach to this research, instead of inheriting his facts, you inherit his methodology and his rigor.
Yeah, that's right.
And that is what allows you to extend his scholarship, rather than further compress his story.
No, that's right. Yeah. I have.
Sorry, did I talk too long?
No, you're
I
good.
had a little plan. Now I lost my point.
So to that point in my 250-page document now, I've counted at least 9 mistakes that I've revisited and corrected in the text, and also there are now additional paintings. And there's additional information that we just didn't have on a number of paintings. So one of my goals with this project is, one, to take it to Phoenix Art Museum, because I'm already in conversation with them, but also to a number of the other museums, and try to somehow organize a sort of revisiting Agnes Pelton with this new scholarship and with the corrections in place too. And sort of also, it's not lost on me that we're coming up on the 30th anniversary of this text. That seems apt, a nice anniversary with a new revisiting of the text. So, anyway, thank you, everyone.
Oh,
yeah.
Oh, come on. I won't say what I was going to say there. Yeah, sorry. Hey. Like that point, that was going to break. Oh, sorry. No, it's okay.
I'm sorry, Kevin.
No, don't worry about it. Good job, Alex.
Thank you very much. I might have to adjust this because there may be some height differences between myself and my colleague. Hello, I'm Kate Powell. I know all of you, you all know me. To ensure that I don't run out of time to do this at the end, as Brighton did at the beginning, I'd like to take a moment to thank my wonderful thesis advisor, David Dempey-Wolf, without whose support I could not have written my thesis or made the paintings inspired by my research. As advertised in my title slide, my written thesis is composed of 3 sections, but in the interest of time today, I'm going to try to condense my first section into just a few sentences so that we can get to the images that I want to discuss. In the Netherlands of roughly the first half of the 17th century, where some people say the story of still life painting begins, we encounter a culture that was just beginning to develop the institution of luxury that was needed to absorb and understand the superabundance emerging at the dawn of global capitalism. the housewives of the Dutch merchant class that was booming at this time become a moral clearinghouse for superabundance. Still life in the Dutch Golden Age is not made for women, rarely by them, and it's not exactly of them, but of spaces marked by women's physical and metaphysical responsibilities, by their supposed virtues and their supposed faults. In his book, which I relied on heavily in my thesis, Looking at the Overlooked, still life scholar Norman Bryson analyzes the male painter of still life's exteriority to his domestic subject in terms of Freud's conception of the uncanny. Bryson develops the idea that the comparative denigrations of woman and of still life are essentially interlinked, and that still life painting becomes a parlor pursuit for women of a certain class by the 18th century, hinges on an often articulated belief that still life took no effort or intellectual power at all to create, and the corollary that women were thus maybe up to this meager task. I went on in this first section to develop the idea that still life's enduring association with beginning painting instruction and the art cultural boogeyman, or perhaps more accurately boogie woman, of the retirement age Sunday painter has hindered its development in art criticism through the 20th century and into the 21st. So the opportunity for still life's relocation from the domestic sphere to the studio in the 20th century benefits no one more than it benefits the woman painter of still life, because it presents an opportunity for the artist to reapproach the conventional forms of still life on new terms, unlinking them from the nutritive or caretaking functions that they carried for so long that can limit their access to a full register of symbolic codes and meanings. Which brings me to my second section, still life of the studio. The studio is where still life goes to gain distance from domesticity. The studio is where still life goes to heal from its mommy issues. The studio is not just a place to make art, it is a subject for art unto itself. Everyone knows Matisse's Red Studio, even if they don't know much else about Matisse. And while this is an interior, it's also, or to my mind even more so, a still life. The space of the studio lacks architectural specificity. It's indicated by an even suede-like application of a single color and by the objects that occupy it. Looking at this, we're aware of red as a primary color, as a color that stands for color and for paint. Matisse abstracts the studio in a way that lets paint announce itself primarily as paint, more than as a simulated space, bringing the idea of the activity of painting into the picture. We're aware of looking at a painting made of paint, of some paintings made of paint. Looking at representations of the tools of the trade of painting in the still life of the studio, we become aware that those same tools were used to create their own representations. And this is an example of what Norman Bryson would call a regression of ontological levels. This makes us sensitive to these forms' transcendence, not just of visual and conceptual levels of reality, but also of points in time. Bryson says about the durability of the forms of still life of the table, that the bowls, jugs, pitchers, and vases with which the modern viewer is familiar are all direct lineal descendants of series which were already old in Pompeii. And I think that's also largely true of the tools of the trade of painting, which are the forms of the still life of the studio. This is not a painting, but a color lithograph, several editions of which are here in the PAFA print collection, which, thanks to Renee, I had an opportunity to see in person last year. I love it very much. This is not a painting, it's a print, and it does not meet the criteria of still life's negative definition, as in a depiction not of action and not of people, but it has a lot of important elements in common with still life. What Norman Bryson says about Chardin, that Chardin innovates an equal activation of positive and negative space, is true of this work as well. The equal engagement of positive and negative space and the use of lost edges collapses or reverses the hierarchy between figures, grounds, and objects, and it equates the two figures with the backdrop of the scene. And I'm going to make an argument that this is at least as much a still life as any other type of picture. Look at the fruit in the lower right that looks not so much like a workman's lunch as it does like a Dutch still life. The skull-like heads that are signatures of Lawrence's paintings and prints are pushed over the line from fleshy head to vanitas skull by the presence of the fruit and the wadded-up tarp in the upper right corner that evokes the draperies of the still life of the table and the objects that are the most prominent part of the print, that sit closest to the viewer in the proposed space and have the highest value contrast. Instead of comparing the skilled labor of the painter with the so-called unskilled labor of the homemaker, like we see in Chardin, Lawrence compares two types of labor that are assumed to be more equally skilled, the labors of the fine artist and the craftsperson. And I think that the differentiated sizes and outfits and poses and compositional heights of the two figures suggest that the larger might be the foreman or the teacher or the father or all three of those things, and the smaller one might be the apprentice or the son, which I think strengthens the connection between the labor of workmen and the labor of artists by gesturing toward their shared history of workshop-based learning on the job. So though this work may not at first seem to correspond closely with the still life of the studio, to me it's the work that brought to my attention the immortality of the basic tools of handcraft and the narrative significance that this can have in painting about painting. And interestingly, in a work that's ostensibly about building, the depiction of architecturally coherent space does not seem to be a priority. And in this way, it reminds me a lot of Matisse's Red Studio. Both suggest that a big part of the importance of the studio and of representations of the studio lies in the mental space that they correspond to. This painting by a hero of mine, Susan Jane Welp, is called, the cup we can see here is called Etruscan in the title of the painting. But even without this clue, it announces itself as kind of an atavistic shape that links itself aesthetically to the ancient Greek xenia, the Pompeii frescoes that perceptual painters are still obsessed with today. And that allows us to steer clear of the idea of breakfast in the world of blueberries, keeping us in the realm of art, talking about art. I think the blueberries are here for the opportunity that they present to paint a massive objects that agglomerate into one complex object. The cup, the blueberries, the coaster, and the Xerox underneath them are so close in temperature that they become one big extra complex object, especially if we unfocus our eyes, which the fuzzy edge quality of the object seems to invite us to do. About the Xerox that's underneath the coaster, we can tell that it's a grayscale image, but we can't tell what of. And I think that void of visual content creates conceptual content that's meta-discursive. The knife in this composition and in several other of Susan Jane Welp's paintings seems to refer in form to the knives that we see in Dutch Golden Age still life. I think of Clara Peters when I look at that knife. But we're still not talking about knives in the way that they work when they butter bread. We're talking about knives the way that they work in paintings. In fact, this knife reminds me of a palette knife that I use in my studio. As in the previous image, there's a beautiful glassine bag that we see sitting under this bowl, and it has a serrated edge that contrasts with the non-serrated knife, and even the non-solidity of the knife, which neuters the knife as an implement of cutting and tells us that it's here for some other reason. It creates a visual asterisk leading to the crown-shaped top of the pomegranate, and then further backward through the implied space of the image to the Xerox tacked up on the wall in the upper left, from which the eye wants to travel over to the upper right, where a drape of fabric is scrunched up, kept really close in value to the wall behind and the surface beneath so that it will be noticed last. Norman Bryson defines narrative in painting as the drama of greatness. And in Susan Jane Welp's still life of the studio, the drama of greatness is not incompatible with the forms of what Bryson would call low-plane reality, the life of the table, as long as these forms can shrug off the associations they've had with what Bryson calls creatural pleasure and hospitality. So the drama then becomes that of the artist's life in the studio. These images do give creatural pleasure, but it's the creatural pleasure of one's innate visual intelligence and sensitivity to beauty and conceptual cleverness. Is that really less ancient and vital than the need to eat? These compositions have been very carefully contrived with Huglow's exactness and Balthus's peculiarity. But in the studio, the subject matter doesn't always have to be contrived because it's already being produced as the natural byproduct of painting. In Sophie Treppendahl's painting Work Table at Night, we're reminded again of the Red Studio. And as you can see, there is a Matisse book in the middle right there. But here the blue that makes up most of the painting surface does double duty as paint talking about paint and as a reference to a specific time of day or night. The primary colored veil over the image makes it so that we recognize as primary colors big bottles of golden acrylic paint. What we recognize as primary colors are enunciated as tertiary colors. This works partly because Sophie Treppendahl is a badass painter, partly because she's chosen some iconic quotidian items, Pamplemousse LaCroix, orange Fiskars scissors, etc., whose local color we're all familiar with. And partly because we as painters know how things look when we've stayed working for too long in our own studios without keeping up with the diminishing light by turning on artificial lights, and our eyes have slowly adjusted so that the most colorful objects we see almost seem to glow with absorbed and retained daylight. And the multiple open beverage containers, they speak to me at least, a fellow studio dweller, not of the culture of the table, but of a long studio session. The seltzer cans are units of time. It's the tactile detritus of the art binge. It's been rendered in a painterly hand that's more succinct than fastidious. It's more persuasive than convincing. But if Matisse's Red Studio doesn't actually show much of the process of art being made, here Treppendahl does. The title of Treppendahl's painting, In Love, begs the question, in love with what? Is it the man in the studies that are tacked up on the wall? Is it the motif of man itself? The art historical motif of the reclining figure? The triangle formed by the arm of the reclining figure in many versions of this motif? Is it triangles in general? Or does the title refer to the flirtatious, intense, exciting, daunting, hopeful, pressure-laden, transitory experience of being about to enter into a relationship with a new painting? We've got a love note, bedroom painting, start twos, scissor handles, which could be a doodled heart on a junior high notebook page. The brushes could be Cupid's arrows. The glove that's draped over the study of a male figure at the bottom of the composition could be groping or caressing. There are a lot of signs for the interpreter in an economical range of shapes. What I really love is how flat this composition appears, or how shallow its depicted space appears at first glance, until you notice the volume of the painting cart, the red painting cart. You can believe that everything on the surface is situated on more or less the same plane, parallel to the picture plane. But even the idea of the painting cart's depth is ambiguous because the cart's back edge melts almost seamlessly into the wall. The little right triangle of sunlight that's projected onto the painting cart is doing the whole painting's worth of heavy lifting in terms of suggesting space, in the details of the outward projecting paintbrush's shadow poking into the triangle's center, the arc of distortion as the triangle falls across the painting rag, and the triangle's broken top tip that spills across the surfaces of the painting cart in the book. Bryson says about the role of space in still life, although still life's techniques assume a mastery of perspective, nevertheless, perspective's jewel, the vanishing point, is always absent. That further zone beyond the table's edge must be suppressed if still life is to create its principal spatial value, nearness. In the still life of the table, the meaning of nearness is generally domestic intimacy and conformity with the spatial expectations of embodied creaturality. In the still life of the studio, as we've seen in Sophie Treppendahl's studio paintings, nearness can signify a vicarious experience of painting in which we're invited to enter the world of the painting in the persona of its creator. This brings me to my third section on rack painting. In a certain type of still life, nearness enters an extreme zone where the perceived interval between the surface or picture plane and the back of the space depicted is null or even negative. This dead partridge with iron gloves and crossbow bolts is a contender for the earliest surviving independent still life painting, 1504. It's as illusionistic, particularly in the soft quality of the shadow to the right of the objects, as any realism produced in the 19th or 20th century. In terms of the motif, it's pretty much what it says on the tin, but what really interests me is what's behind the things mentioned in the painting's title, the wood grain background. The surface on which this painting was painted was a wooden board. So what Barbari had to do to make this painting was prepare the lindenwood board, most likely with rabbit glue-based gesso, to cover the wood grain, then paint onto the prepared panel an illusionistic emulation of wood grain of a very similar tone, which we can tell because of small strips of exposed wood at the top and the bottom of the painting. Many works of so-called 2D art ask us to symbolically equate the surface of the work with all the distances that the work depicts simultaneously. But in trompe-l'oeil, we're asked to do this more than symbolically. We're asked to really perceive optically the co-identity of the surface of the work with the background or substrate of an image. And therefore, we have to accept the idea that whatever rests on that background exists closer to us than the picture plane, projecting into our reality, like an analog hologram. To fool the eye, though, is not the same thing as to fool the mind. When we stand in front of this painting, if we stand in front of this painting, we only need to step to one side and get a more diagonal view to destabilize the optical illusion, if you want to. But an illusion's permanent stability is not the source of the pleasure it gives. We like to make and break illusions and enjoy the plasticity of impressions that our senses can obtain under certain arranged conditions. In the late 19th century, there was a revival of trompe-l'oeil painting that began here in Philadelphia, and it centered on the work of three prominent artists, John Pato, William Harnett, and John Haverly, who all studied or exhibited here at PAFA during their lifetimes. From at least the time of Plato, many viewers of art have taken issue on philosophical and aesthetic levels with hyperrealism or illusionism, so maybe it's not surprising that these late 19th century paintings were not always looked on with respect. Some people saw them as tacky, and those who did see them would be as likely to encounter them in a saloon as they would in a gallery. In my discussion of this painting in particular, I have to acknowledge the work of the art historian Judith Barter, and in particular a talk that she gave at the Art Institute of Chicago about 10 years ago. So the paintings of Pato, Harnett, and Haberly were encoded with themes of Gilded Age America. Scientific and technological advances, an emphasis on standardization, the rise of professionalism, specialization of labor, and increased tensions between labor interests and the interests of big business, and a shift away from religious values for a lot of Americans. Here we have another simulated wooden board. This one is painted on canvas, on which there are an assortment of items with interrelated meanings. We have a train conductor's pocket watch, we have a rosary with a folksy wooden crucifix, a pair of playing cards, and then underneath that are crammed a ticket stub, a pawnbroker's receipt, a cigarette picture, and a photograph. As a brief aside, the trompe-l'oeil revival in America at this time is occurring against the backdrop of the popularization of photography. This painting was begun in 1889, and in 1888, just a year before, George Eastman of Eastman Kodak brings to the market the first simple consumer camera. But photography is not the only novel technology that American trompe-l'oeil painting is dealing with. The measure of the passage of time itself was undergoing standardization and was coming into conflict with a religious conception of time. Judith Barter explains that in the late 19th century, timekeeping was a subject of debate, which was prompted by increasing problems with railroad schedules, In 1879, there were 5 different time zones in the state of Connecticut, one for New York, New Haven, Hartford, Boston, and New London. So the idea of time was fluid. It was determined by the natural rhythms of the sun specific to each community, which is maybe a more painterly sense of time. But the local nature of time became problematic. And the American Meteorological Society standardized a lot of measurements, and it recommended that time zones be invented. So in 1883, Canada and the US debut the Eastern and Central time zones. So keeping time becomes a modern invention. And the religious fundamentalists of the time believed that the artificial regimentation of time was blasphemous, and the crucifix represents the scale of God's time, which is eternity. And again, the feature that might be last to be noticed, Judith Barter doesn't discuss it in her analysis at all, but what's most interesting to me is the what's behind all of this, what's at the margins. The tacks or nails all along the canvas's edge, which are illusionistically painted, which are pretending to attach the simulated board of the painting to the real wood of the frame that's outside of it. The viewer equates the depicted background of the trompe-l'oeil work with the picture plane or the actual surface plane of the work, so that the items that are depicted on it appear to project out into the world of the viewer. But this is working in 2 directions in this case. The detail of the tacks not only underscores the illusionism of the composition as a whole, but it's actually sending the real wooden frame that surrounds the faux wooden tableau into the reality plane of the painting in like a reverse Who Framed Roger Rabbit thing. The combination of the real wooden frame and the simulated wood, the back of an imaginary painting perhaps, calls to my mind, and I think almost certainly must be, a reference to Cornelius Hysbrecht's The Reverse of a Framed Painting from 1670, which is a very early entry into the genre of conceptual art. And this trick is still fresh 400 years later, and almost a century after Haberle, when Lichtenstein picks it up. Stretcher frame revealed beneath painting of a stretcher frame. I love this painting. This is what I think of when I think of Lichtenstein. It's a painting of a stretcher frame that's torn away at one side from its stretcher frame, revealing the simulated stretcher bars underneath. It's a painting of a painting of a painting. And it's possible that what we see on this surface closely emulates what actually existed on the painting's verso. So there's no question of illusion in the sense of trompe-l'oeil here. Lichtenstein is playing in the conceptual space of trompe-l'oeil, and with the opportunity that that space presents for regressions of reality that are playful and are surprising now, and not tacky as of old, because this motif's customary illusionism has been suspended. If Jacob Lawrence's Builders can be called a painterly print, then this is a printerly painting. Lichtenstein is substituting his version of illusionism, which is an emulation of mass communication printing, for that of 16th to 19th century trompe-l'oeil painting. So now, in the 3rd decade of the 21st century, when paint is allowed to be paint again, for now, while also not being obligated to just be paint, we need new strategies to bear upon the evidently indefatigable motif of objects in shallow space. This brings me to a lot of what has propelled me in the studio recently, and to the final painting that I'll show you today, by my teacher, mentor, and friend, Kimberly Trowbridge. In Kimberly Trowbridge's Letters to Bobby, we're back in the artist's workspace, but we're also in the visual tradition of letter rack painting. As in 19th century letter rack painting, this proposes a very shallow or null depth space. And there's a modulation of registers of illusionism within this composition. Open, tight, modeled, flat, representational, of recognizable submotifs versus depicting apparent passages of abstraction. Modulation and degree of articulation of these separate subsurfaces that we see. But among all these transverse modulations, what prevents the whole thing from sliding into chaos is color and form. We have a primarily red-green, secondarily yellow-violet palette that orbits a gray of middle temperature and value. And this, together with the object's roughly rectangular forms, provides structure. I really appreciate the treatment of the cast shadows, the property of the whiteness of paper, whereby it reflects colored light into the shadows cast upon it. Each shadow has its own procession of values and temperatures. Kimberly is suggesting either multiple light sources or multiple times of day, or both. And the artist's signature that we can see in the lower left corner seems like it could just be another word written on a piece of paper or the wall, like Bobby and really. And to my eye, it's a gesture toward Bryson's idea of ontological regression. Kimberly Trowbridge demonstrates that a single painting can be and contain a line drawing, a landscape, a color chart, a headless portrait, a still life of the table, an abstract composition, a note to self, a note to Bobby, and metadiscursive meditation on painting, in painting. And by not committing to a single stability of illusion, this painting gets to have its cake and eat it too, pleasing us in the terms of our experiences of looking without substituting itself for the looked at thing, and reminding us of the subtle but very important distinctions between being convinced and being persuaded, being tricked and being seduced. Thank you.
Questions and or comments for
Kate,
Yes, Kate.
I'm very curious about the use of shadow and how Sophie kind of takes that away, or maybe she uses light instead of the shadow. Yeah, and so she uses color and form to push you back, as you demonstrated. This one's maybe a little bit flatter, and so anyway, I was kind of just wondering, you made a note about the subtle shadow in the 1504 painting, and I really was, yes, I was very curious about how you think you want your paintings to cover in this notion of how we read a construct and how we read something that is more inventive.
Thank you. As you know, as we've discussed in my critiques, I have sort of two bodies of work, one of which is more observationally based, and the other is the other is more imaginatively based. And I have been seeking to forge convergences between those two trains of thought. I think that one of the things that, sorry for the slide whiplash here, one of the things that Sophie does really well is she is representing things in space and giving us a specificity of time of day or a specificity of quality of light, but she's approaching that very graphically. She's approaching everything very graphically, so that the idea of painting isn't being erased from painting. It's sort of not hiding the way that it was made. That's one of the things that I admire the most. One of my favorite details in this painting is where she's forgotten to put the cap back on the tube of what I think must be green paint, and the paint is oozing out like toothpaste. And I wonder whether that was a real moment in the studio or whether it was an invention. But I like to think that there is some amount of romanticization or idealization of the studio practice happening in these paintings. Not only because of how clear her shapes are and how intentional they seem, and how that does not, at least my experience of being in the studio is a lot more chaotic. You know, nothing ever lands quite so perfectly as this. And I also like the idea of, you know, self-mythologization as pertains to the studio practice. I think that's something that I have learned about from my mentor, Kimberly, that, you know, you sort of create this myth or story of yourself, and it's maybe a little bit theatrical. Before we began our symposium conversations, Kevin was talking about Dr. Richards was talking about his wardrobe calculations. And I think that that is part of the myth of self. And the way that we show up in the studio and the way that we like to document what we do in the studio and fold that into our art is part of this myth of self. And I think that's something that I have not quite stepped into fully in my work, and something that I would like to explore further. And I think that that might help me resolve, or not resolve, but trouble and play in the boundary between the invented and the observed. Mark, yes?
Yeah, if we go, I love the subject matter. It's pretty cool, pretty interesting, very interesting. If we go back to the blue paint, right there, it's interesting that, you know, that the artist does have examples of vessels containing painting for details, right? But yet, the dominant color being blue, there's like the absence present of a vessel containing blue, right?
Yes, that's very interesting. It's almost like the blue tape
The
is
blue is
standing
there.
in.
Yeah, you miss it, but it's there, very present, right? I don't think I see or saw a blue. I mean, you have the tape, but the chaos is unified by the dominant color blue, which is, you know, what pulls everything together. But yet she takes the time to play that trick in the paint of not showing a blue vessel or paint vessel. Right?
I'm so happy that you noticed that, Mark. I'm really happy that you noticed that. This there's another painting of Sophie's that I didn't, and I hope I didn't cut you off, but there's another painting of Sophie's that I didn't show that is a spread of books of art reproductions all on her studio floor, and then her takeout lunch in the corner of her MacBook. But one of the paintings that I was really excited to notice in that arrangement was one of my very favorite Lois Dodd paintings, where Lois is casting a shadow onto the grass that's in front of her. You see the shadow of her figure, you see the shadow of her easel, and then you see the corner of her easel. But the painting that's on the easel is not the painting that we're looking at.
Yeah.
So there's like, it's almost a regression, but then it's not.
So she's playing with your head,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's the game that I think that is present here.
Absolutely.
It's the obvious, you know, blue is not that obvious, right? Because it's not present as one of the vessels. And I don't know, maybe we need to take a look at the yellow one that you showed following this one to try to understand what's the aha moment that she's trying to convey there. But anyway, that's just a detail that I noticed from the blue one.
Well, one thing that I notice in a lot of her paintings, and that is true in both of these, is that there will be like a little shard of light that disrupts the sort of cast that lies over the whole of the painting, the sort of cast of light. But in deviating from it, it makes it more precise. It specifies it.
Yeah. Well, she's dealing there with the concept of scarcity, right? If you throw light in many objects, then you're just creating, you're let's say devaluing that point of interest.
Mm-hmm.
That little shard of white there on the table, it's wonderful. That's all she's giving you.
Mm-hmm.
And the reflection on the paintbrush, the red. Yeah,
Thank you, Mark.
very good, excellent.
Well, when you look at Fairfield Quarter, for example, right, and then you get, the shadow becomes a thing in and of itself. It's just not, you can't deny that, right? And it's kind of the thing that actually sucks you into this painting, right? So, you know, it's very interesting. I never really thought about, since I'm so flat thinking, about what this shadow does, unless it's an actual shadow, or, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
If it's like a little crescent or something, you know?
Or just like a little T-square of a drop shadow that's in some of these late 19th century Trompe l'oeil paintings. You know, it's, you know, and sometimes there are some of those paintings that really blow me away, and there's other times when you see this like little there's like throwaway black line that indicates the shadow, that almost cheapens the idea of the illusion, because it's like, oh, you know, you picked these extraordinarily thin objects because it's much easier to execute an illusion when you're talking about a space of an inch depth, you know, so there's a little bit of like a, but but you know, then when you think of that graphically, it becomes a little bit more interesting. And I think that the little the square ruler on the wall here is almost like a disembodied version of one of those shadows in a much more interesting way.
It kind of makes it, I mean, it's like just so beautiful.
She's kind of the best, isn't she? She's kind of the best.
The stabilizes the image.
Questions and/or comments?
Now this is making me think about the Red Studio, and I feel like there are no shadows.
Yeah. No, there are not. And I think that's part of, you know, when I was mentioning that it's sort of a space defined by the objects in it, that may have been calculated in order to allow these little things to live more in the language of collage, or to sort of be postage stamps in this color field. But what's really interesting, there was so much research that I didn't get to include even in my thesis, let alone in this whisk through my thesis. But there's a period of about, I don't know, like 1,000 years in the story of still life painting where cast shadows, which were previously known and understood, completely disappear. And then you get to like a lot of like early medieval fresco, and there's no cast shadows anywhere. It's like they've completely forgot how to do that. So, you know, Sister Wendy says, I love Sister Wendy. Sister Wendy says, art changes, but it doesn't get better. So it's interesting, these innovations that can be deleted and then reemerge in the story of art.
Thank you for the presentation, Kate. I think, you know, I was really glad that the Red Studio came up through Kate's comment, and the way that, you know, I think you've opened up a lot of questions that, you know, certainly pertain to art as an artifice, but also a representation of reality, and this kind of philosophical terrain around the frame. And is the frame bordering off a world unto itself? Does it cut off a world that existed in the past? Does it lead into our world? All the above, as well as this kind of implication of shadows vis-a-vis reality and temporality. And then I think there's also just a linguistic component to all this that then, you know, roots itself into, you know, a lot of imponderables within the terrain of Western metaphysics. So still life, but, you know, why not to a more dead nature, as the French would call it. And then there's a problem with both those terms, because it's trying to pin down.
I resent them both, yes.
Yeah. And this is, you know, what Derrida writes about in one of his posthumous seminars on life-death. Instead of saying life and death, life-death, and really smashing them together. And I think, again, the way that thinking about the logics of representation, the way that we're always working in a representational world, creates this kind of tension between when it's clearly something that's a representation for versus everything that we don't think of as a representation that we necessarily go through in our daily lives, in the way that art allows for a speculation of what happens when we run with some of those slippages. But I'll leave it there because I could probably go on for a little bit there, so thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you to Kate and Brighton for starting us off. Hope to see you all on Friday for day 2. Thank you.